this is my 12th in-person World Water Week. I've been hearing about it for a long time, and I don't see that much happening. And it concerns me as an individual, as a member of an institution, because I feel like the scope of the problems are only growing. So how do we accelerate that kind of change? That's what this session is really going to focus on. We have an exciting set of speakers that are going to give kind of quick interventions about their ideas, their approaches about not just risk, but also resilience. And thanks for cleaning up my slides. I'm going to start off my presentation with actually a really short story. I started working, I'm mostly work on water and climate issues. I've been working on them for about 15 or 16 years now. My very first trip was actually to China around 2007. I was kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool, and I, on very short notice, found myself traveling around cities like Shanghai, Wuhan, Beijing, speaking to hundreds of Chinese officials, especially on water and climate issues. And at the end of the trip, I'd gotten to know the translators a little bit, and they said, you keep using this word resilience and talking about resilience, and we need to tell you that actually the word that we decided to use in translation for that word doesn't mean much in Chinese. And I said, it's okay, it doesn't mean much in English either. So what I really hope is that maybe by the end of the session that we have a more shared, more common understanding of what it is, what it possibly even can be as we move forward. So this is an idea of deep resilience that forest trends and agua have been using for a really fairly short time, maybe 2 years or so, to try to think about trying to capture some of this idea about maybe where we're headed, what we need to be moving towards. Thanks, appreciate it. So one of the really big issues that we see is especially in the climate world, but I think I hear this term very frequently now. I've heard it almost incessantly during World Water Week this year, is the idea of deep uncertainty. Deep uncertainty has a kind of formal definition. There's actually a society that's housed in the Netherlands, Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. It's a really cool group. It's worth checking out if you haven't before. They have this kind of formal definition that they use for deep uncertainty. What I'd say deep uncertainty really is, though, is I don't know what the future looks like. And it's often expressed in questions like, I can't tell if it's going to be a drier future or a wetter future for me. Do I prepare for both? How could I possibly prepare for both? California, for instance, has been thinking a lot about its 1,200-year drought. And then about a month ago, there was a major paper that came out to get ready for meter-plus rains, like these kind of super floods that are also going to accelerate. It is very expensive. It is very problematic from a policy perspective to get ready for a super drought and a super flood at the same time. There's not enough evidence to plan, prepare, to design, to even think about what getting ready really looks like. And this idea, like, how do I even navigate into the future? It's a really deep problem. The traditional way that we've approached uncertainty in the water sector especially is to say, let's just overbuild things. We'll add 10% to the height of our levee. We're going to add 10% to our storage. That's not really sufficient anymore. That does not match the kinds of problems that we're really facing. So flexibility is probably the biggest idea that's been a response. Flexibility is a relatively new way of thinking about how to respond to deep uncertainty. Maybe the most famous person in this area is a very sharp researcher at TU Delft and Deltatus, Marjolein Haasnoot. She's done a huge amount of work in this space with an approach called adaptation pathways. But kind of generally, what does flexibility look like? It might be trying to be staged and modular, trying to think like we're going to do this now, and in the future, we're going to add, if necessary, some extra steps to it. We might try to build in redundancy into our systems. And we might just say, actually, we've been reliant on one system, one source of water one source of energy, when actually we need to really diversify the portfolio of resources that we're drawing on, so that we don't get caught in a kind of convergent crises. And the hope, if you're managing a protected area, if you're managing a hydropower facility, if you're a farmer, is that you can navigate through time. You want to make sure that as conditions change, that you can make shifts. One of this term deep resilience, I think, is a kind of alternative approach to how we might be thinking about moving beyond just flexibility. Flexibility is often very difficult in many institutions, many countries to respond to. AGWA works in a lot of countries, and the idea of going to an LDC and saying you need to build the institutional capacity to track and maintain this problem over the next 2 generations is overwhelming. It's very difficult to do. It's hard enough to do in the most developed countries, and I think we're going to actually hear some good examples of that. But this is an observation, like a term that we've come up with to describe what we feel like we've been seeing. The idea that we can develop more durable, reinforcing, interlocking, and resilient solutions, basically by opening up the problem space. Our long-term approach for defining water problems is to say, we're going to focus on one thing. We're going to maybe even slice off the edges of that problem to narrow it down so it gets as solvable as possible. I think deep uncertainty says that's a really bad idea. We actually need to make it much broader. We need to actually combine problems, and we need to build them in a way that they overlap with each other and that they reinforce each other so they evolve over time. Thanks, Vin. So the deep resilience, I think, is this hopefully kind of emerging idea that can capture this concept. I'm a biologist by training. I like to use biological examples, probably overuse them a bit. But this idea about how we think about defining the problem right at the beginning of our decision-making space, I'm borrowing from an obscure part of biology called cladistics. It's how we define like one species instead of another. And the people who do taxonomies, say for fish, they get into these terribly vicious arguments. They say these 2 species are actually 4 species. No, these 2 species are actually 1 species. These 2 broad groups are called lumpers and splitters. It's a little amusing to watch them fight sometimes, but the reality is that it's a natural system. A species is a human idea. We actually have problems defining them. It's kind of a choice by the biologist about what they're going to do. And I think what we have done in water is we've been splitters. We've tried to divide things. We've said that's an energy problem, that's an agricultural problem, that's a water utility problem, that's an ecosystem problem. And that's where I think we actually need, at the very beginning of our decision-making process, is to say, we need to blend these ideas together in a more coherent way. We need to become lumpers. So, and a quick example of that, I think, is BMZ, a German Ministry for International Cooperation and Development. They developed a couple of years ago, I promise that they're not sending me a check after this. They developed I think, a really interesting program where they actually had water in a kind of separate program, and they pulled it together with human health and with biodiversity and ecological health. They said, actually, we cannot separate these problems. That's a very interesting approach to thinking about policy, actually, that climate change, that human health and ecosystem health actually belong in the same basket. So I think that's a very interesting approach to lumping. And I'm going to give one quick example. This is from some colleagues with USAID and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a good Guillermo example. This is from the 2nd largest city in Thailand. It's Udon Thani. It's in the north of Thailand. It's the 2nd largest city in Thailand after Bangkok, and it has like a really key role in Thailand's economy. It essentially sits between Thailand and a lot of Southeast Asia and China. So it's a major transport and trade hub, and it's seen spectacular growth, even by Southeast Asian standards, spectacular growth. And they have become very worried about a whole range of issues. They have seen a lot of flooding, but they've also seen a huge increase in the amount of competition for water, and of course, really extreme droughts. And the water scarcity issues are really between hydropower and farmers, irrigators. How do they balance between them? Because exactly when the hydropower facilities want to hold the water is when the farmers need the water. And they've come really close several times to absolute agricultural disaster. So, and then the last part, this is one of the things that was really articulated to the team on the ground, is that the mayor very earnestly turned to the project lead and he said, you know, I want my kids to have a nice place to live, that they actually want to stay here. We don't want to look like Bangkok. It's a nice place in its own way, but that's not who we are. We want to make sure that the quality of life actually is really important. Those are 4 problems that traditionally we would have thoroughly separated out from each other. This is the mayor. He took like a very kind of open, stakeholder-driven process. This is the kind of heart of bottom-up thinking, and he actually he did something very brave. He said, if we bring more people in the room, we're actually going to hear, we're going to come up with better solutions. To me, that's kind of at the heart of this lumping idea. We're going to be able to connect these problems together and result in more comprehensive solutions. Got it. So how do we bring these issues together? Actually, there's a methodology called CRIDA. These are the team that were involved in that process. This is the kind of rough sketch. It's really interesting. This is one of the design diagrams. It's actually building a whole series of lakes in the city, kind of transforming this urban landscape to capture both floodwater and supplement storage, really reduce DRR. And it's actually had a very interesting impact on the health of the city. People have really embraced living with water in their city, and it's reduced all the pressure on this. I need a new picture because they're almost done with the project now. So and I think this kind of stakeholder ownership has been very critical in the process. Very quick example from California, the idea that the broad system in California is that for 200 years, arguably longer, California has used a brilliant nature-based solution for water storage. It's called snowpack. Snowpack is going away. Snowpack is disappearing very rapidly. And the effect is that the wet season, the winters, are becoming much more flashy. They actually are increasing in their flood events at the same time that the summers are getting much drier. This combination between more intense droughts and more intense floods is a widespread issue. And that the immediate response by policymakers was to say, what we need to do is we need to build more storage. But there was a very interesting team. They said, let's actually think about this problem in a completely different way. Let's move our storage from the top left, from the snowpack underground. Let's actually capture those floods, channel the water down by working with private landholders. Let's move from one NBS to another NBS. It's floods and droughts are actually not separate problems. They are the same problem. It's a brilliant solution. It's one that actually needs to be used in lots of places. They had 2 years of a test. It's scaled up to 15 other basins inside of California in the past 6 months. So I think a very powerful demonstration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John Matthews from Agua. Reimagining Recoveries is a session convened by by Agua Forest Trends and Reconstruction con Cambios, which is a Peruvian program to rebuild. It is funded by USAID, Canada, GIZ, and the Boughton Foundation. I want now to introduce Gena Gammie. She's the director of the Water Initiative at Forest Trends, who will do a poll to catch your opinions on recoveries. Please, Gena.
Buddy, we're so glad to be here with us today. I have a couple of hats in this session. Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. I have a couple of hats in this session. So the first one is to invite you to participate and give us some reflections on how to think about recoveries that build resilience. So if you go into your app for World Water Week and you go into this session, you'll see an option for a poll. I haven't seen this actually used in other sessions, so we're going to experiment a little bit. And here we have 2 questions for you. I'll give you a second to get to our session. If you go down, scroll down and you go to polls, where you would see the chat box, you'll see 2 questions. So one is, what does a recovery that builds resilience look like? We're going to get your input and build a word cloud together. And then the second one is, what tensions come up? So what's weird about thinking about recoveries that build resilience? What seems really difficult about it? What sort of doesn't make sense? So we invite you to throw those wrenches in there also. And together we'll come up with this poll. So we'll revisit this when we come to the Q&A with the panel towards the end of the session. And thanks in advance for your input. So let me hand it back to Boris and we'll continue with our presenters.
Okay, thank you very much, Gena. Some logistical indications. You can introduce your questions in the Pathable app. If you are looking at us online, please introduce your questions. We will come back to them during the Q&A. We will have some live questions as well. You also see some publications that we have in the room, so please feel free to take those. Those were produced in some of our projects, and they gather evidence on nature-based solutions, especially for rebuilding better. So now I want to introduce the panel. So we will have 4 people here. First, I want to just give a complete introduction. We will have Allison, Woodruff, Principal Water Security Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. We will have Gena Gammie also talking on behalf of the Authority for Reconstruction con Cambios in Peru. We will have Julian Katchinoff from the Water Team Lead at the US State Department. And we will have Josefina Maestu, Water Advisor from the Ministry of Ecological Transition of the Government of Spain. We will start with Allison. Please, you can come to the stage. I think you have your microphone and you can control your slides right here. Let me just put full mode.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'll be speaking about the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, in Asia and the Pacific, and how ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has been working with countries in our region to support inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recoveries in our region. So just to set the scene on the state of water security in Asia and the Pacific, around 500 million people in our region don't have access to basic water supply, at least basic water supply, and about 1.14 billion people lack access to basic sanitation. We're one of the most disaster-affected regions in the world. About 80% of people affected by natural hazards globally are in Asia. Of that, about 55% of the global death toll is in Asia, as well as global damage in Asia accounts for about 26%. On average, about 20 million people are displaced from their homes each year in the region because of disasters and weather-related events. So even before the COVID pandemic hit, Asia Pacific, the water security situation was already very insecure. ADB produces a publication every few years called the Asia Development Water Outlook, where we look at 5 key dimensions of water security. And we found that in 2020, 22 out of 49 countries in Asia and the Pacific were categorized as water insecure, which accounted for about 2 billion people. So the pandemic hit, and the posed higher risk to water security. So this graph just shows the situation, the COVID situation versus the no COVID situation. And it was estimated that in Asia Pacific, about 70 to 80 million people were pushed into extreme poverty versus the no pandemic situation, setting back poverty reduction efforts by about 2 years. So what were the specific issues and challenges for the water sector? Well, I think, first of all, for the pandemic, it really exposed the inequalities in WASH. Access to basic water and sanitation among women, low-income groups. Of course, when they don't have access to basic WASH facilities, that exposes them to heightened COVID risks. Our service providers in Asia and the Pacific also struggle with human and financial capacity, very low levels of digitization. So when we had lockdowns in Asia that lasted months, it was very hard for utility providers to go out and do monitoring of systems, to go out to do billing and collections. So that posed another big risk. And of course, financial sustainability, because once the pandemic hit, people stayed home. So commercial revenues fell, and water demand at the household level increased. So trying to manage that. And that restricted mobility of COVID affected day-to-day operations, construction, maintenance, supply chains, meter reading. Where I live in Manila, we didn't have meter reading for at least 2 or 3 months, which again impacts the revenues of utilities. So there was big financial disruption in terms of budgets. Government diverted their budgets to addressing the pandemic, which affected, again, subsidies that were given to utilities to be able to operate. So how does this situation set up for then building resilient recoveries? And I think it's really critical to highlight the linkages, of course, between pandemic proofing, so building resilience to future pandemics, building resilience to climate change, as well as building inclusivity, ensuring that everyone has access to basic water and sanitation services. So first of all, so ADB issued during the pandemic a COVID-19 guidance note for the water sector, which sets out some of these strategies looking at short, medium, and long-term approaches. But just to briefly summarize those, I guess, first of all, in terms of building resilience, improve financial sustainability and capacity is critical for water service providers. I mentioned the case of Manila, where we didn't have our meters read for 2 to 3 months, but because Manila Water is an extremely financially sound utility, they could weather the storm. But many utilities that don't have quite as much financial robustness really suffered, and critical service levels also suffered as a consequence. People's resilience is critical. So early warning systems, having that capacity to respond to disasters. And then decentralizing services. We know that when a disaster hits, if you've got, say, a centralized wastewater treatment plant that gets hit, you can knock out service for weeks. Whereas if you've decentralized your wastewater treatment services, that sort of spreads the risk. And we heard, I think, John in his presentation talk about nature-based solutions and the power of nature-based solutions to build resilience. Digitization, another key one. The pandemic really also exposed how powerful digitization can be. Those utilities that had adopted digital practices like payment systems, smart metering, fared much better during the pandemic. And so digitization is critical to also building resilience. And then, of course, universal access to WASH is critical. So that, one of the easiest strategies for building resilience is, at least if you have basic hand washing and sanitation facilities, and of course, targeting the most vulnerable with WASH investments. So ADB, I think in terms of our portfolio, we have a portfolio of about 26.5 billion, and over the next 3 years, likely to upscale, we anticipate to about 16 billion. The majority, 85% of our projects are gender mainstream. That means that we have specific interventions to ensure that women can benefit from the projects and our investments that we support. And around 40% of our investments support climate adaptation, although we're aggressively boosting that, recognizing the need to accelerate progress and moving towards and building climate resilience. So for us, this is really an opportunity. The pandemic was really an opportunity for us to promote green, low carbon development in the region. focusing on, as we said, pandemic proofing, building climate resilience, and building inclusivity. So just in conclusion, to summarize kind of the key takeaways in terms of responding to the pandemic and moving forward with recovery is making water central to sustainable rural development. So in promoting water efficient irrigation in our region, irrigation accounts for about 75% of freshwater use. So we really need to focus on using it more efficiently to reduce pressures on say groundwater resources, which are suffering from over abstraction in the face of future water scarcity, building community-based disaster resilience. In urban areas, investing in water and sanitation and infrastructure services to expand WASH, promoting a healthy environment. So addressing wastewater pollution, promoting more circular economy approaches, again, anticipating pressure on future water resources and being able to reuse some of our wastewater to address that. And of course, integrating nature-based solutions, which are a key element of any resilient strategies. And I guess finally noting that the public sector governments can't do this alone. So we also really need to focus on building partnerships and incentivizing the private sector to come in and also invest in resilience. So I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison Woodruff from the Asian Development Bank. Now we will have Gena Gammie. She's the director of the Water Initiative at Forest Trends, who will be talking on behalf of Reconstruction con Cambios from Peru. Gena.
Thank you. And actually, so the executive director of Reconstruction con Cambios, Robert Lopez, was going to be here. And last week, there's a bit of a political crisis happening in Peru at the moment. That meant that he wasn't able to come. So I have his slides and a video that they've prepared. We work closely with Reconstruction con Cambios. I'm with Forest Trends, and we're leading the implementation of a project funded by USAID and Canada with a bunch of local partners to scale up investments in natural infrastructure for water security in Peru. And as part of that project, we work with water utilities, with regional governments and private sector, as well as large national programs. And Reconstruction con Cambios is one of our key partners because of the significant emphasis that they've been putting on including nature-based solutions in this portfolio to rebuild after significant floods and landslides that happened in 2017. So I'll start giving their presentation. And again, I'll share the regards of the director who would have really liked to be here, but of course we are adapting and this is it in practice. So I'd like to start with this video that they've shared. If we have, I think we have it just queued up to play here. Yeah.
In 2017, the northern and central parts of Peru were severely affected by heavy rains as a result of the El Niño phenomenon. It caused floods and massive landslides that left 115,000 homes destroyed. 100,000 people were affected, with more than $3 billion worth of economic losses. If there is something that this natural disaster taught us, it is to learn from the mistakes of the past in order to rebuild with a resilient and safer future in mind. This is how the Authority for Reconstruction with Change was born, to develop sustainable, inclusive, and accessible infrastructure in health, education, roads and sidewalks, sanitation projects, agriculture, transportation, and comprehensive flooding solutions for rivers and streams. This is for the benefit of Peruvians affected by the El Niño phenomenon. In addition, thanks to the government-to-government agreement signed in 2020 with the United Kingdom, we have signed 15 contracts for integrated flooding solutions for 13 rivers, 5 gully systems, and storm drains for 2 cities. This is an investment of more than $1.7 billion. Our entity has opened the doors to companies that want to participate in the next procurement processes for projects in our country. And we invite you to look at our website, www.rcc.gov.pe, where you can register for a webinar that we will be providing in October, where we will give you more information about the integrated flooding solutions and the next projects of the Reconstruction with Change. Because for every hospital inaugurated, road and school rebuilt, with a comprehensive approach to disaster risk management, there are thousands of citizens believing in a better Peru. Let's continue rebuilding together.
Okay, so the background of what caused the reason for which Reconstruction con Cambios was established, as they summarized in the video, the mission of the authority is to rebuild all of this infrastructure that was damaged in these floods and landslides, but also to invest in future resilience of 17 coastal watersheds that are highly vulnerable to these types of events in the future. And so we started working with Reconstruction con Cambios in 2019 because they had this mandate to include reforestation. At the time wasn't called natural infrastructure, it was just reforestation and forest plantations, which in Peru means pine trees and natural grasslands in these portfolios. And we started working with them to figure out how to do that in a way that would really build resilience. And so these are the slides from Reconstruction con Cambios, and this is kind of the conceptual framework of what's going on in a poorly managed watershed that creates the conditions that increase risk of extreme precipitation events will result in landslides and floods. So if you have deforestation, degradation, overgrazing, and you're not managing these extremely steep slopes that we have in the Andean region, you're much more likely to end up with with significant landslides and erosion events. So when Reconstruction is thinking about these integrated solutions, which is the part of the program that is meant to build resilience to future events, they have three components of these plans. So there's gray infrastructure, both in riparian defenses and in abatement dams, and then there's natural infrastructure, mostly looking in the middle and upper parts of the watersheds where we're doing restoration and terracing work, and a little bit of natural infrastructure actions that are being incorporated into the downstream riparian defenses to deal with floods when they actually happen. And so when we look at this natural infrastructure component, this is the watershed that we want to be able to see. We want to see restored forests, grasslands. It looks like plantations, but it would be native species reflecting the natural composition, working with local communities also to ensure that there are economic opportunities in the restoration of the landscape, terracing, incorporating a lot of these indigenous and local practices that have withstood millennia of extreme events along in these areas. So these integrated solutions are being developed in these 17 highly vulnerable watersheds in the Peruvian coast, and they're large projects. So each project is at the scale of the watershed as part of this integrated plan that's really trying to tackle the reasons or the risk factors that contribute to floods and landslides. So Reconstruction con Cambios, I think, has one of the largest, I haven't seen any portfolio that's larger in terms of nature-based solutions for climate resilience and water security, at least in the Latin American region. There's over $200 million of investments only in the natural infrastructure components that are under development. This is the amount that has already been approved and is going towards, and it's involved in these procurement processes that they mentioned in the video to hire a consortia that will do the final studies and then lead implementation on the ground. They have been doing procurements all year. They just are closing some of those processes and about to open new processes, and they hope to start actual implementation in March of next year, which will be very exciting. And so just a little bit more detail. So when in these natural infrastructure projects, what we're thinking about is restoration of local ecosystems that are in important areas for reducing flood and landslide risk, what they call brown infrastructure, which is basically soil retention practices, stabilization practices, especially terraces, or in Peru, they're often called andenes, and infiltration trenches to reduce runoff. And then all of the social engagement, local capacity building, governance to be able to support the sustainability of the projects over the long term. The direct benefits are to reduce the risks of floods and landslides and directly restore over 89,000 hectares of landscape. Those are the areas that would be directly intervened. So the landscape that is restored is actually larger. Supporting the resilience of over 17 cities and a number of other agricultural production areas and other infrastructure. And then also a number of co-benefits that they're recognizing, including protection and restoration of natural habitats, biodiversity, soil restoration, air quality, seasonal water regulation, carbon sequestration. We've estimated that this portfolio could get Peru halfway to their 2030 target for carbon sequestration from ecological restoration as part of their UNFCCC targets, and strengthening local economies, including generating a number of local jobs. So that's a general overview of Reconstruction con Cambios. And just to end with a couple of reflections on what we're learning about what's difficult about this. Two things. So one, these procurement processes have been really challenging. So these projects are much bigger than anything that has been done in natural infrastructure in Peru before. And so finding teams that have experience in natural infrastructure in Peru and meet the conditions to, with historical levels of execution, are able to actually apply for procurements at this level is very difficult. We invite you, if you or colleagues would like to participate in the next procurements, please check it out. These we need good people coming to bring their expertise and to lead this sort of implementation. And then the other part I would reflect on is actually just a reflection of the fact the director is not here today. I think when we think about recoveries, at least I sometimes have this idea in my head of a recovery that happens in sort of the calm after the storm. We have an event, it's serious, it's extreme, and then we have some time that's quieter where we can rebuild. But of course, that hasn't been the case since 2017. We've had a pandemic, we've had in Peru, I think 6 presidents in the last 5 years, huge, social and political crises, especially with rising food and fuel and fertilizer prices this year. And so I think one of the lessons that we're beginning to see is how do we think about recovering itself as an exercise in adaptive management and resilience, because we're going to have to be doing this in an environment of continued shocks. So I'll leave it there and we'll continue with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Gena Gammie from Forest Strength. Now we will have Julian Katchinoff from the water team. He is the water team lead of the US State Department. He will be talking about learning from past recoveries to build resilience. Julian, you can use this to pass your slides as well. I can help you.
I'll be curious to see what slides
Oh,
are.
you don't have a slide.
I'll pretend. I'll go along with it.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I have to say, I find it a little strange to be talking about resilience issues in a room full of resilience experts, which kind of leads me to believe that John invited me to speak simply because I laugh at his terrible jokes. So for those of you who I don't know and who don't know me, maybe just a quick word on the State Department and why there's a water team lead. I generally have a soft sell approach to explaining my job, which I personally believe is one of the best water jobs out there. The soft sell sort of goes like this. I work on these issues and I think about these issues along with my colleagues through the perspective of diplomacy, in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Water, which is a sort of an atypical place through which to look at water. Normally you work at an agency that has regulatory responsibilities, technical capacity, engineering, development assistance, foreign assistance monies. And we have some, but not all of those. Rather, how we approach the issues, we look at water issues as they relate to US foreign policy, national security interests, which really gives us a very broad appreciation for the links that water has for society, for economies, for regional cooperation, for security issues, and how they play their role in shaping our societies, our personal lives, our relationship with others, and crucially for this session, resilience. In a nutshell, our responsibility is global freshwater issues, of which, of course, transboundary water issues being critical, water resources management, WASH, and increasingly resilience to the impacts of climate change. Back in 2012, around the time that I was starting at the department, the U.S. intelligence community came out with a seismic work that looked at the national security implications of water stress. And they found that in the decade to come, partners for the United States would face significant water challenges that would in fact diminish or degrade their ability to cooperate with the United States on shared priorities. And I have to say, in the decade that has elapsed, we have seen those things come true. So good job to those authors. It manifests itself. We see it in the headlines, and candidly, our team sees those water challenges play out daily in cables that we receive from our colleagues in embassies around the world. Issues that you're all familiar with and that you see in your own work, but water pollution, water scarcity, extreme weather events. Even just this week, we're seeing extremes play out around the globe. So what do we do about it? We have a whole of government global water strategy, which brings all of our interagency colleagues together, about 15 different agencies, NASA, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, along shared objectives. We're in the finishing stages of our latest draft of our new version of that strategy, and I'm pleased to report, and I think what's crucial for this discussion is that we are including climate change as a part of an objective, one of our 4 strategic objectives, but also as a guiding principle for how the U.S. government will work on water going forward. And that means bringing climate considerations throughout all of our objectives and all of our interventions. So that hopefully, I mean, easier said than done, but hopefully will mean that climate considerations and resilience approaches will feature from ground level interventions in USAID projects to the way that NASA and NOAA do their work in terms of working with colleagues or sharing data or designing their models and their applications. That's part of a broader, would be remiss if I didn't mention broader Biden administration's focus on climate. I think we've seen it domestically in the Biden Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which invested the most significant amount of resources to water domestically in the United States in decades, as well as other climate focused initiatives on the President's Emergency Action Plan for Adaptation and other water initiatives. So where does that leave us? A few messages that I would love to contribute to this discussion, things that I think I've observed and that I think are tailored to what we're trying to tackle today. The first is we are seeing a changing and accelerating demands on the water sector. Again, not a surprising statement to make at Water Week, but we are being tested in ways that I think are unprecedented. And we are not, I think, responding with the speed that we need to be able to meet those demands. The other is, I think we're seeing a real premium on shared challenges. I think one point that I would make, one of the things that I think was really important in the White House launching an action plan on water back in June was the way in which we were talking about water challenges domestically and internationally as common. For many years, I think there was perhaps a false assumption that water challenges were in other countries or in other places. That is, of course, not the case. But I think it is important for us to realize that through shared challenges, hopefully come shared solutions. And I think I know from my colleagues in the interagency who deal with these issues domestically every day, in many communities are facing challenges related to climate. They understand that those are the exact same that other colleagues in other countries are facing. I think that can only point us to stronger collaboration. Speaking of collaboration, I think that's my final message, and I think one that I'd love to reflect on with all of you, which is collaboration, cooperation in terms of transboundary, shared river systems, but also across sectors and across scales is absolutely critical, and we're not seeing enough of it. In fact, I think we're seeing a retrenchment. And I think we need to do whatever we can to help support that going forward to be able to build the kind of resilient systems that we're looking for. One sort of area that I would point to, I have some colleagues from USAID who are here at the week, and I would encourage you to reach out to them. Starting this fall, they will be launching a new phase of under the Global Water Strategy for what they call country strategies, which means in a number of high priority countries where USAID is focused, they're going to be taking a broad, comprehensive look at what are the systemic water challenges, of course, putting a priority on climate, and designing collaborative solutions along those lines. And I think we'll be looking for input from a broad range of stakeholders. And so I would encourage you to reach out to them and see how to be part of that process. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian Katchinoff from the U.S. State Department. Now we will have Josefina Maestro. She is a water advisor in the Ministry for Ecological Transition in the government of Spain. Please, Josefina.
Okay. Food for thought. But anyway, I hope you also find interesting what I have to say. What I do is just this. Yeah.
With the
this
next and back.
Okay. So I'm talking about the drought in Spain, and so which is happening at the moment. So it's not future, it's not past, it's happening. And I'm going to try to answer the question that John posed for us, which is if we are better prepared, are we more resilient? I will really learn anything from what we have happened in the past. So I think we heard that this idea of the nature-based solutions make us more resilient. There is issues about how that can provide co-benefits. But I think maybe my presentation will look into that. Maybe we need a mix of solutions to become more resilient. So let's see how far we have gone. So this is a dam in Spain at the moment. This is what is happening. So you can see we can walk in the dams, and we can see churches that we didn't see in the past. So this is, this is what we have left, very little water in our dams. You can see that the percentage of precipitation this year in relation to the last decade, in some places it has been only 25% from the average. Most of Spain is rainless than the decade before. So it's only very few places in the north that has been more rain. Not only about rain, you can see it, you have seen it in Europe, no? We've been hot. On Saturday when I was here, we were very hot. Well, what you can imagine in Spain. So this obviously affects water demand. So it's not only about water supplies, it affects water demands as well. People need more water, not only for drinking, but also for agriculture, for producing crops. And the changes in crops are not there yet. So that's a big problem. And you saw the photograph on the water reserves in the dams. How does it look like in terms of the water reserves? The average of the last 10 years, sorry, it's in Spanish, is the one on the top. Can you see? And so this is what happened this year. So this year is really very low. We have an average of 36% of water in our dams, which is our main water supply source. And from our capacity, and in some river basins, is varying between 18% and 22%. And when the dams are very low, much of the water cannot be used. So dramatic. What can I say? Okay. Lessons learned. So let's go into the positive part and try to see whether we are now better prepared for these situations. The first lesson is that we need to really look into it very clearly. We need to monitor what is happening so that we know what is coming. How is it evolving, how grave it is, what is the problems, and take into account not only the indicators related to rainfall and temperatures, but also the level of exposure of the system. Because there are river basins that are more overexploited than other river basins. So it's not enough to look at the climatic evolution, but about the situation that we are in terms of how much water resources, how are we using the water resources. So that's in terms of the lesson one, so look at it. Lesson two is to plan in advance. So try to be preventive, not reactive, so be ready and do that at all levels, both at river basin management level, which is this drought plans. We have drought plans for all the river basins in Spain. They are in the webpage. If you read Spanish, you are welcome. and there are emergency plans for municipalities of more than 20,000 people. So this was a lesson from our past droughts, to really be ready to negotiate with the stakeholders before the droughts about the measures that need to be taken, including restrictions, so that you don't have to do it when you are in the middle of the drought and everybody's nervous and everybody's in a mess. And so try to make sure that you do that in advance. Of course, people are willing to say yes when there is not a problem, but they have already said yes and they are in the plans, so they are there. So invest, in those plans, and also in these emergency plans. These have been very important. So not all the municipalities of 20,000, of more than 20,000 people have them yet. So that's one of the issues that we really need to get into more in Spain. And basically, what is very important about this is about defining responsibilities, who has to do what, establish coordination mechanisms. Julian before was talking about this idea of coordinating between different levels, between different stakeholders. Well, in these plans, we try to already plan that. And include communication. So really have a plan for communication. Not only the emergency measures, I will tell you a little bit more about the emergency measures we are already taken, but also try to include communication in there. Okay. Lesson 3, think about the types of measures you need for the different levels of drought. There are sort of droughts which are not so problematic, and there are droughts which are very extreme droughts. So you have a typology of them. So that goes between, at the beginning you really maybe only need hydrological planning and monitoring, and when there is an emerging situation, then you need to think about restrictions and alternative supplies, emergency supplies. That's what we are doing right now. I mean, for example, now water is being brought by boats to the Bilbao area, okay, from different places. So those kind of emergency measures, try to think about them in advance. And the other day we had a meeting of the urban water table, we call it, now with the emergency situation, and the water utilities were saying, we have to be, we already have the measures. Taking the water by boat to Bilbao is not a drama. It's okay. That's something that should be part of the way we are thinking about it. Okay. Lesson 4, and I think that's probably where the resilience comes more strongly. Reduce pressures. You know that in Europe we have the Water Framework Directive. It's all about getting good water status. Good water status make us more resilient. And so to do that, what do we have to do in Spain? In Spain, there is a number of river basins. You can see them here with a water exploitation index, which means that we are in a problem. Guadiana, Guadalquivir, Segura, Júcar. So we are exploiting more resources than we have. And that's possible because we have desalination plants. So otherwise we couldn't have those water exploitation index. We wouldn't be there to start with. But what is very important in Spain is that we have stopped building irrigation projects. And also all the reserves we had in the dams, are not being, they have been taken away. So they will not be for new uses. So what we say is this is as far as we can go in terms of water resources. I mean, some of us would like to go farther, but at least, we are really having this idea that we need to stop having more pressures on the system. The lesson 5 is something that I think John was talking about also, about this idea of diversifying resources, diversifying risk, creating a slack. I mean, the point of this is, how can we pay for this? Who pays? And, can we afford it? But the reality is, yes, that what we are doing that, we have a slack capacity on desalination plants, mainly in the Mediterranean area. All these are the types of water resources we are using. Some of them, in some areas that you can see, they are really only surface water. But in most of them are a combination of groundwater, desalinated water. Each of those water supply sources have different qualities. Desalination is very expensive, is high quality, and is reliable. Surface water is very cheap, but it's not reliable. Groundwater it can be good quality or bad quality. Some of them is polluted. So you need to think about those water resource sources, not only as cubic meters, but as what it provides in terms of your resilience, okay? And lesson C, which is about be ready for emergency measures, both in terms of water restrictions and emergency infrastructure. So we have a set of emergency wells in Spain that we don't use normally, that we only use them when there is a drought. For example, Madrid has a whole, they have their own water supply sources. Their dams are better, 67%, because they are not used by irrigation mainly. It's only for water supply. And also we have a whole system of wells which we don't use. So we will have water for about 2 years without, rain. So that's a little bit better than in other places. And also, measures like I was telling you before about transportation by boat of water in the Bilbao metropolitan area, etc. And just to give you an idea of the kind of emergency restrictions that we are doing now, these water restrictions, we are cutting, there is 300 municipalities that we are having problems, mainly in small and medium-sized municipalities. The bigger cities are better prepared for that. And in those medium and small-sized municipalities, we are cutting non-essential uses, so swimming pools, gardens, etc. We have cuts at night. We are reducing pressure of the system. We are refilling the water with tankers, with lorries. We are distributing bottled water. And so those are the key kind of issues that are in the emergency plans. And then you activate when there is a problem like this. So, I mean, we're still having issues. And I think, as I said, I think we are not ready enough for small and medium-sized municipalities who are dependent on only one supply source. So that's a little problem. And they cannot diversify, they don't have the money to invest in desalination plants, etc. And also something very important that I haven't heard a lot about is this idea of multi-annual management of dams. So don't think about the dams because, because of the licenses, if there is water in the dams, you have to provide water for irrigation. So you can think about in 2 or 3 years how you manage your water. There may be opportunity cost to manage the water in a different way. So I have some lessons in relation to the resilience, but maybe we can do that in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Josefina Maestro, a water advisor at the Ministry of Ecological Transition in Spain. So we are going to the panel now. So people that are looking in Zoom, please put your questions in the Pathable platform, and we will have some live questions as well. Please feel free to collect some of the publications that you see in the tables. They are produced specifically to talk about evidence on how we can rebuild using nature-based solutions for water security. So please, Allison, Josefina, Gena, and Julian, we will have the panel here. We will be collecting live questions. So if somebody has a question, ask for the microphone. So we will have one. Before we already have two. So I will go with the live question. I think it will be more interesting to see. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Oh. So I just need to use a loud voice here. Thank you. Those were wonderful.
Can you introduce yourself and then go to the question?
Wonderful presentations. Neil Lazaro is my name. I'm part of the Australian government. I work on agriculture and water related issues. So I have a comment and then a question, and the comments for Josefina. So I love what you did. 3 years ago, I led a team to deliver Peru's first ever drought management plan. And it was in the one region that's not on your map. It was in Tacna, right at the bottom. And I guess my reflection comparing Peru to Spain is Spain's a really wealthy country in the scheme of things. And we went as far as you did, I think, with the drought management plan from reactive to proactive. But what we also did was do a socioeconomic vulnerability index, and we mapped that against the water insecurity so that when you have to make a really hard decision about where to invest scarce resources, you understand the vulnerability of specific communities where many communities are in fact vulnerable. I'm happy to share that project, the reports with everyone. My question was around deep uncertainty, and I guess I wanted, because everything we heard about deep uncertainty was it was a biophysical challenge. We're not sure about future climate or future water, but I wondered whether social and human dimensions fit into deep uncertainty as well. And what I'm asking is, you know, one side of politics in my country is all about building dams, and the other side's all about nature-based solutions. And I don't think they'll ever reconcile. So I do think that's really deeply uncertain. And so how do you think about the sorts of long-term recovery that you're talking about in your own countries where you've got this deep uncertainty that's kind of grounded in social and political doctrines? Thanks.
We can start with Josefina and then other people can jump in as well. You don't need it, you have your own microphone. Yeah.
But my own for the people who are not here. I don't know. I agree with you that there is this now, you know, two trends of how we think about this type of issues, but I don't think we are so much apart. I mean, we are talking to each other. So at least in the context of Spain, it's true the mainstream is not nature-based solutions, but the nature-based solutions, and I think probably it's been discussed here, is that it's coming very, very strong, mostly in the flood management realm. The flood management realm is the one who I think is opening the ground a lot to this kind of solutions. And I think it's becoming, at least in Spain, it's becoming mainstream. So, and we have a huge investment program on that. But I think for me, the most relevant issue about your question is the socioeconomic systems, you know, it's not only about the types of solutions, but about how do we think about the wider socioeconomic questions? Because obviously in countries like Spain, where we are going, by the end of the century, we are going to have a reduction of our water supplies by 24% and 40% in some areas. There is no any other choice than changing the way we use water. And that's all in the socioeconomic realm. And it's not in the water sector. The water sector is not about changing, you know, our economy, and so that links to the fact that we need to bring, you know, other actors into, if we are going to be able to adapt to climate change in countries like Spain.
Any other person want to give a comment? Julian?
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll just make the point. I explicitly did not just point to biophysical in my comments, but you know, I think part of that is because we understand that most of the folks that are actually impacted by water decisions are not attending Water Week, right? They're outside of this room. Yeah. Just on the sort of nature-based solutions, I mean, I am definitely not an expert, but I think my sense is that the whole debate between gray and green is a bit of an abstract one, and that when you start to actually ground it in specific areas, specific projects, you quickly realize that for a variety of reasons there it's both. The degree to which it leans one to the other is context specific. And, you know, and ideally we'll get to a point where we, you know, are using a system that has less trade-offs, negative trade-offs. But I think the important thing is that the link between what you're saying and nature-based solutions is that my understanding is actually green infrastructure, nature-based solutions require far greater societal involvement and interface, right? In terms of maintenance, in terms of operation, in terms of integrating it into urban landscape. That's a feature that is not as readily apparent in gray. And so I think that's an important shift that we can use to our advantage.
Want to comment? There is another question. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, with the Jensen.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to comment on the presentation you made on the water security in Asia and the Pacific and the impact of the COVID. My name is Mulea Keches. I'm from the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council from Zambia, with the regulator for water and sanitation. So I think I would share most of the challenges you experienced in terms of the COVID and how it affected the water utilities, and in particular on the issue of collections, because I mean, in terms of paying for the water bills, we saw a really drop a real drop in terms of how people are paying. People are not paying. In fact, the government made a pronunciation that, you know, no one should be disconnected from the service, even when they're not paying. So that really affected the utilities in terms of treatment chemicals. They were not able to have enough money for that, later on paying for their staff. So in reaction to that, I think we saw a lot of, you know, uncoordinated efforts from different stakeholders coming in to try and help the utilities. And there were a lot of gaps here and there. Most utilities were not able to treat water. Even up to now, they're still trying to recover. So I'm trying to find out from you if there were any, you know, strategies that you put in place to try and help the utilities to recover from such impacts. Thank you.
You have your own microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. And yeah, interesting to hear the similar challenges felt worldwide, whether it be Africa or Asia. Yeah, I think for a lot of our utilities, I mean, this was very much a learning experience, the COVID shock. One of the challenges that you know, many utilities were already struggling to deliver services, struggling to be financially sustainable. So COVID was just one more shock on top of that. But yeah, I think through the pandemic, we've learned that, you know, you have to anticipate these things. We provided quite a bit of budget support to countries so that governments could extend emergency credit, emergency support to utilities to continue services, even when they weren't getting revenues, as you said. I'm not sure what the experience in Africa was, but yeah, great to learn to see whether there's good practices that can be transferred to the region. And then in terms of pandemic proofing, I mean, one positive thing we're seeing from utilities is things like wastewater monitoring. We're seeing more utilities adopt that, which was never done before the pandemic, and more interest has been put into that. So hopefully that will be our early detection and warning next time to be able to anticipate and plan accordingly.
Great. One question for you all. How do we recover? How do we build resilience when we have successive shocks? We have the pandemic, we are living a climate crisis, we have an economic crisis. How we build resilience that is able to successive shocks? We can probably start with here while we think of other questions. If I see some hand, yeah, okay.
Well, I don't, it's like, that's the biggest question. So I'll just start with maybe one reflection that actually goes one part of the discussion earlier about the kind of socioeconomic aspects of deep uncertainty. And it made me think of this case with one of the water utilities that we work in Peru, that had historically had this sort of latent conflict with some communities near one of their key water intakes. So it's a lake that supplies 40% of the city's water. And every 5 years or so, something would happen with this community, and there would be, you know, a kind of moment where it would be very tense, and then they would continue on. And during one of those episodes, the community blocked access for maintenance workers to do maintenance on this water intake. And so there you began to see actually how even with gray infrastructure, we often think of it as sort of, you know, pipes and built infrastructure that doesn't have that social dimension. But I think a lot of times it's there, it's just not actively managed. And so it was a huge crisis that ended up being resolved in part by a negotiation that began a payments for ecosystem service program there, which helped to respond to some of the interests of the community to be more engaged, but also just created this platform where now there's an ongoing dialogue between the utility and that community, and the utility has a couple of people whose job it is to maintain relationships and to engage both for the nature-based solutions, but also it's a way to kind of let some of those concerns be kind of aired and discussed in a much more productive way. And so I think part of that, you know, somebody mentioned those coordination, I think the coordination mechanisms, right? So those types of ways where we can begin to have this sort of early warning system, but also on the social side, not only on the biophysical side, in ways that are going to affect both kind of the natural system and the built system, and to be able to kind of navigate things that we won't be able to anticipate today when they come up, by already having those relationships in place, which I think like reminded me of what you said, Josefina, where it's very difficult to establish those when you're in the crisis. But if you already have those, you've broke bread, you've built some trust, then when you're in those moments, then you can navigate them better together. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think what we've seen, we have, and I don't mean to be glib, but we have the luxury of some fairly recent crises, global crises. And so we can sort of see how we've responded or not. And I think what we've learned, and this is, I think a general sentiment, is that we've been able to identify really what is most important in society, in our lives, to be able to move forward. I mean, in the early days of the pandemic and lockdown, we realized, even though most, I think, hadn't, that grocery workers were a critical part of our overall supply chain and sustaining all of us. Same in water. I think we need to understand that certain services are critical, and invest both in process and resources and in coalitions to be able to sustain those and build that kind of resilience. That's easier said than done. I don't know if we've seen enough of it, but at least that's the first step, is recognizing it.
Yeah, I'm losing this.
Okay.
The question, I think, for me, maybe is the pathway to resilience. Probably that's very important. How we get there, and the first thing, it seems to me, is to recognize that we need to be more resilient, and so that we need to. That's a problem we want to address, and it's not always the case. I'm also, I have already, when I was talking, that some ideas on how you become more resilient, decrease your exposure, so being less exposed, and that's very important. So reduce your pressures, increase your flexibility, be prepared. So there is already there some lessons. But for me, something very important that maybe I haven't talked about, which is behind the averages, the big numbers, the average, river basin, it's the local issues. I think at the end of the day, becoming resilient is a local problem, and water is a local issue as well. So we really need to look at what are the socioeconomic issues at local level that we are addressing. So the country level is very important. I think we need to do that too. But I think the local level is important, and in that context, we need to look at. I don't know whether John mentioned that, about this idea of just transition. How do we provide enough opportunities for people who are really affected by droughts, but also about possible changes that we need to make in terms of water uses, and how do you address that issue as well? So the whole question of providing alternative opportunities to local communities, I think is part of the path to resilience. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I heard the term yesterday. Someone actually used the term perma-crisis, and I think that's really what we're in. This is not just a blip. This is our normal from now, and I think that's the challenge. Especially water supply sanitation. If we're planning, for example, infrastructure, which will have a 50-year life, and we're working on the information that we have today, how do we make investment decisions? And that's hugely challenging. I think others have said it, building in flexibility so you can source diversification. So if your surface water dries up, you can flip and you can rely on groundwater desalination. It's really interesting to hear Madrid that has 2 years of groundwater emergency supply that can be tapped into. It's about building in redundancies, knowing that maybe one of your treatment plants will get knocked out. So having decentralized systems to be able to be more flexible and respond, I think, are critical. In Asia as well, it's not just the climate crisis, which is a big one, but also we're rapidly urbanizing. So population growth, and in some cases can't be anticipated. You might have huge immigration, and you have to flexibly be able to deliver services. So yeah, I guess in the face of a permanent crisis, just anticipating and having flexibility to respond accordingly.
Yeah, we have another question there.
Thanks very much. My name is Joe Shuttleworth. I work for I'm an engineer. I work for a company called Arup, who are sort of water, a broad engineering company. By a sort of happy coincidence, I haven't come to this session on purpose. We're the technical advisors on the Peruvian Reconstruction project as part of the UK government contract. It's super interesting, all the different perspectives. But I was particularly taken by the Spanish case study. And some of the my question is framed around some of those socioeconomic aspects of it. And there's been in the news quite a lot. I think even just this week around the economic activities which use water in Spain, and agriculture being very heavily driving that, and then now that competing with tourism, which makes up a lot of Spain's GDP. And my question really is, maybe what lessons are there, or what's happening in Spain to actually encourage that transition to more sort of water sensitive or sort of climate resilient economic activities? Because, you know, if maybe it could, maybe from the US perspective about how that's being approached from a sort of intergovernment perspective, so working on projects in different locations to encourage sort of more sustainable economic activity based around changing water resources. So there's sort of two perspectives. The US one only came to me as I was asking the question, so it might not sound very good.
I think that, you know, obviously there has to be an economic transformation in countries like Spain to be able to adapt to how our water resources are going to be. The question is when and how. This is what I was trying to tell you, that this is obviously a local issue. And, you know, the main instrument we have in Europe to do that transformation is the Common Agricultural Policy. And I think a very important part of the transformations that are happening in Spain, in the energy, in the environment, issues, etc., have to do with this pertinence to Europe. And I think Europe is now realizing that the drought is a common problem. And I think it's not only about Spain, it's about all of us. And so I think if we can somehow get together and have a proper drought directive where it's also included the idea of rethinking our uses, that will be very useful. But I do think that we are starting to have ingredients to start rethinking those kind of difficult issues. Those are the most difficult issues. I mean, I just been in a conference on droughts in the USA, and the elephant in the room was exactly that, you know, how do you think about redoing your socioeconomic structure around those new water resources? So I haven't provided you a straight answer probably, but I do think there is some light in the way, in the process on how to get there. We have a little time.
Julian?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as Josefina figures it out, we'll have an answer to give you. I mean, I think, you know, from a sort of water policy, you know, my personal perspective, I think the window of opportunity for dialogue around what those options might be in the United States right now is widening, given you know, the near constant imagery about droughts in the Western U.S., the Colorado River, you know, and recent drought declarations are forcing, you know, real impacts, but also I think there's a growing recognition of the long-term trends that, you know, people in the know have been sort of pointing to for a long time, but now I think are really rippling through, you know, a whole range of society. So, you know, who knows where that'll go, but, you know, political change comes from that recognition, I think, and so we'll see what the response is from folks in the region, but definitely, yeah, on the cusp, hopefully, of some positive shifts there.
Thank you, Julian. We will have the last question. If you can write also your questions in Passable, then we can send them to the panel and hopefully get some answers that we can give you back in the platform.
Great. Thank you so much for a really interesting discussion. My name is Kanika Takar. I am a green response and environmental advisor for the Swedish Red Cross. It's a little bit of a different angle. But I mean, we're also really trying to advocate a lot for, building resilience in the communities that we're working with, whether they be in Sudan or Bangladesh, Myanmar, wherever they might be. But these come with, big changes. And Josephina, you also just talked about the need for a just transition and these huge livelihood changes that come across what you were describing as what's happening in Peru, where we're changing the way that people are using the lands and taking away how people are operating in that space. And so I'm really curious to hear, how do we do that in better ways? What are the options that have been presented in Peru or elsewhere to make sure that we have sustainable solutions in place where communities can really get behind them and don't feel disempowered by the work that we have to do?
Great question. And I think it begins by designing what you're doing in any landscape with the communities and hearing from them, working with them. A lot of times there's a lot of really rich local knowledge that has been passed down where they have been able to live with significant risks and shocks throughout, maybe hundreds of years that communities or more that communities have been there. And so being able to value and maybe kind of reinvigorate or scale up somehow that knowledge can be really valuable. But then I think we also need to be really clear about really what are the trade-offs that could be generated by certain interventions, be as transparent as possible about that. And we might need to pay people to implement changes in the landscape if that's what is, or offer to pay them and see if they accept, if that's what's needed downstream. So I think, for example, and that's a challenge in Peru when it comes to like limits on how public investment is spent, how, public contracting rules, it's difficult to do that. And so I think we have to rethink also all of those rules and be able to be more flexible in order to ensure, justice in the transition.
Yeah, maybe just very quickly. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's also connecting communities with opportunities and linking, I guess, to valuing ecosystem services. So communities that are dependent on, say, forests, watersheds, if you can get systems like payment for ecosystem services, which adequately value these services, then those communities can benefit from those investments in resilience, which is the watershed projection, and make them part of it and to benefit and see value in that rather than deforest, cutting down forests. So I think that's also part of the conversation.
Thank you very much. We will have now Kate Broman with final remarks, but I want to thank the panel. Please give them a round of applause. Please, Kate.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today and for staying through this. I feel very lucky that I get to be part of summing up the end of this session. So just a few words and then I'll let everybody get to lunch. I don't want to be between you and the food. And I think, where we need to start is if we're in a panel on recovery and resilience, then the bottom line is that things aren't great now. Even without disasters, there's a lot we need to do. And then we know that these kinds of disasters are happening. There is risk. We can't de-risk. So there's a lot that we need to think about moving forward and to make happen. And I think, coming at this with this idea about deep resilience and linking questions and linking the solutions is something that really resonated from this panel with me, and I hope with you also. So really thinking about, what is it that we need to be concerned about? What do we want to get to the bottom of? What are the real problems? What are the real consequences that people actually care about? And that'll lead us to where the real solutions are. So much of this is about talking to the folks who are invested because they're the folks who are affected. And I think, a huge piece of what this comes down to also is that we've managed the biophysical side for a long time. It's expensive, but in many ways it's less politicized. It's easier. It's not that building a dam is without a lot of friction, but I think we often think about supply side management as being something that's easier to do than demand side management. And yet it's clear that we can no longer afford to just do supply side management, either from a financial standpoint, but also from a political standpoint. And so we have to look to the demand side. We have to think about how are we structuring our water use, which means we have to think about how we're structuring our economies. And we have to think about how we're structuring our politics if we're thinking about how we structure our economies. And that's all of that was right here in this discussion that we have been having today. We can't think about water alone. We have to think about what we're using water for, what are the benefits that people are getting from it, and how do we make sure that we ensure that people are getting the benefits that they need. And some of that is obviously going to be directly water related, but an awful lot of it is going to be about, other pieces of this puzzle. So, as we think about sort of where we're going and what's happening, just two thoughts that came up a lot: efficiency and flexibility. We are still thinking about trying to solve these problems with efficiency, and yet resilience tells us that efficiency is very dangerous when what we need is flexibility. And again, this brings us back to, it's not just about doing more with what we have, it's about thinking about what do we actually want? How do we use things other than water to get to those endpoints we care about? And if we're going to do that, we need a plan, because, if we're in a perma crisis, if we are in chaos, if the crisis doesn't end, then we need to be thinking now, and we need to be thinking seriously about what are we going to do every single time there's a potential to change things and make things better, so that, we can be a more resilient, just, equitable, and generally better place, because that's what I want. And I bet it's what all of you want too, or you wouldn't be here today. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just in time.